Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Disaster, which is episode 5 of season 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the 5th season episode, Disaster. So Disaster is the episode where the Enterprise hits a quantum filament and the ship is completely damaged and people are trapped in various sections of the ship. You have Dr. Crusher and Commander LaForge are trapped in a cargo bay and where a plasma fire has started and they're threatening to lose oxygen, so they have to join together to open the cargo bay to put out the fire, but in doing so they're deprived of oxygen, so they have to rush in order to get oxygen back into the cargo bay. You also have a storyline with Picard trapped in a turbolift with 3 children. And the turbolift was damaged and was about to fall, so Picard has to lead the children out in the shaft to climb a ladder before the turbolift falls. You also have a storyline in 10 Forward where Worf has to deliver Keiko's baby who goes into labor, and then you have a storyline with Counselor Troi having to take over the bridge because she is the senior officer, and there's a emergency where the Enterprise could explode, and Rose suggests that they separate the saucer section in order to save everyone in the saucer section because they can't confirm that anyone's actually alive in the star drive section, and that way when the engines explode, the saucer section will be saved. However, O'Brien calls that plan damn cold-blooded, saying that just leaving everyone in the star drive section to die, and so he suggests a plan where they try to send the information to engineering where this problem can be fixed, so people in engineering can see that there's something wrong and they can fix the problem. So Troi decides to go with that plan. And meanwhile, Riker and Data have to make their way to engineering from 10 Forward. They come across a sort of electrical storm that Data has to walk through in order to dissipate it so they can pass, but that damages Data's body, so they have to disconnect Data's head, and Riker carries it to engineering and then connects Data to engineering where they see the problem of the ship about to explode, and they manage to fix it in just the nick of time. So, this episode is a personal milestone for me. We've reached a personal milestone for me. I actually been waiting for this. It's quite an important episode for me personally, because this was the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that I saw when it first aired. So every episode before this one I had watched in syndication or VHS, or long after the fact that it actually aired. And I do remember this being the first time seeing an episode while it was airing for the first time. So, to be clear, this was not the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that I saw. I honestly don't remember what that was because I wasn't really paying full attention when I watched the first couple episodes of TNG. It took me a little while to get into it. I was actually more into TOS at the time, which I was also watching for the first time at the same time I was watching TNG for the first time, because I told the story before, like sometime in 91, or maybe it was actually 1990. I watched Star Trek 2 and I loved that movie, and I watched it again and again, and I eventually got into it and started wanting to watch TOS and TNG. In fact, it was my sister who had the idea to start taping every single episode off of TOS and TNG off the TV, and we had like collections of VHS tapes when we write it down. And so she was the one who was into TNG. I wasn't really watching it, but I would watch it just casually while I was more interested in the TOS episodes, which is ironic because I like TNG way better than TOS right now. But my entry point was the movies, so I was more familiar with Kirk, Spock, and all of them. So I was watching TNG for a little bit, like the reruns and the syndication, before I started to get into it and finally decided to watch it regularly and watch the new episodes. So I had already seen quite a bit of TNG up to this point. Not a whole lot, but maybe 15, 20 episodes, something like that. But casually, not paying full attention, so I don't really remember them very well. I don't even remember which episodes they were, but I remember I was already a little bit familiar with TNG before I saw this, but this is when I started getting serious about watching TNG and started watching it on a regular basis. And I remember that, I do remember very clearly, and I had missed the 4 episodes that aired before this, although my sister had taped Silicon Avatar and Darmok on VHS, so I did watch those episodes after I watched this one. But I'd missed Redemption and Ensign Ro, and it would be like another year until they finally hit syndication. I actually get to watch those episodes. So I didn't know who Ensign Ro was, because I missed that episode, and I was just watching so this is the first time seeing her, and I remember being like, who the hell is this? Because I was familiar with the rest of the crew, and my sister had to explain, oh, this is new character they just introduced. But this was only the second episode she appeared in, to be fair. So yeah, from now on, from this point onward, so all the reviews I've done for all the episodes I've covered, from the original series to animated series to Next Generation, all of those things before this point I had watched originally in reruns. I saw everything after the fact. But from this point on, pretty much every episode that I'll cover of Star Trek from now on, I saw when it was first aired. Now, there was a scattering of like a tiny, like 2 or 3 episodes of Deep Space Nine I missed when they first aired. And it was maybe 5 or 6 episodes of Voyager I missed when they first aired. There's a lot more of Enterprise I missed when it first aired because I was living in New Zealand and I was reliant on Captain Jack Sparrow and Captain Flint in order to watch Enterprise at the time, because the new episodes weren't airing in New Zealand, so I missed quite a bit of those when they first aired. But other than that, pretty much everything, especially in the near future, until we get to like season 4 of DS9 / season 2 of Voyager. Actually, no. Season 5 of Deep Space Nine / season 3 of Voyager is when I started missing a couple episodes here and there. Up to that point, from here on out, I saw every single episode when it aired. But even after that point, I saw most of the episodes when they first aired. It was just a scattering that I missed here and there. So it's quite significant for me. This is a milestone for me personally. So it changes really how I see the episodes. Having that memory of watching it when it first came out. But anywho, speaking of my sister, we always used to joke about this episode that it was a Space-quake that hit the Enterprise. I was like, oh yeah, this is an episode where that space earthquake hits the Enterprise. Because the whole episode plays out like a typical disaster movie, and that's implied with the title. I mean, it's obvious that's the intention, and they pull off this intention well. And so we just used to joke around. It was like an earthquake. We compared it to like earthquake movies. Like there was one called Earthquake, and there was a bunch of TV movies and stuff. But I did find out later that this is actually modeled off of the Towering Inferno which I've never seen that. I've heard some other people compare to the Poseidon Adventure, which I'll be quite frank, I never even heard of that movie until the remake came out in the 2010s, or was it the 2000s, something like that. And I watched that. I thought the remake sucked, but never saw the original, never even heard of it. But yeah, I can't even remember what other disaster movies, but there were other ones I was more familiar with, maybe centered on earthquakes, which is why, I don't know, we used to call it the Space-quake episode. I think that, there was one on NBC, I think it came out before this one, called The Big One. But anyway, so yeah, it's a typical disaster. And so the whole point of the quantum filament was just a bullshit excuse to do a disaster movie. So it might as well have been a space earthquake. In fact, I've heard recently the original idea for this episode was to be an asteroid hitting the Enterprise D, until the science advisor says that's fucking stupid. That makes no sense whatsoever. So alright, fine, let's make up this thing as quantum filament or whatever. And so I've heard some other people who reviewed this episode complaining about the quantum filament and being like, well, what exactly does that mean? How does that affect the ship? Why aren't they prepared for these things? And every time I hear complaints like that, I'm thinking to myself, you're missing the point of the episode. The episode doesn't care. The writers don't give a shit. They don't care about any of those logical arguments. They don't care about what the hell quantum filament actually is. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to do a typical disaster movie in a Star Trek episode. How they get there doesn't matter. They just made up some bullshit at the top of their heads just in order to get to the point where they could do a disaster story where people were trapped in various sections of the ship. Which, I'm okay with. I do take that in consideration, though, when considering how much I like this episode, to be frank, because the idea, it's clear that they don't give a shit about the idea, and it's just a contrived way just to get to the point of imitating a disaster movie. Now, I don't typically like when they just imitate typical formats like disaster movies or whatnot, when they just copy and paste a format that's been shown in movies and TV before. I typically don't like that, and I do hold that against this episode a little bit. But there's some great character moments in this episode, so that's what is willing for me to forgive it a little bit. And it's funny because I watched a whole bunch of reviews for this episode, and there was one in particular where they they despised this episode, thought it was the worst thing ever. And another couple of reviews I watched who really loved it and thought it was really great. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, don't really agree with either extreme. Because they do follow a lot of the standard cliches of disaster movies, having different groups trapped in different places. The trapped in an elevator thing is a cliche. The pregnant woman having to give birth in the middle of disaster where someone untrained has to deliver the baby cliche. That, for me, that's probably the worst cliche this episode does. And so, and then the two people trapped in a place where there's a fire or something and they have to put it out cliche. So I'm definitely by far most interested in the storyline with Troi taking command of the Enterprise. Because I suppose that could be a disaster cliche where someone who is lower down in the ranks has to take command, maybe for the disaster movies that are involving a military structure. But it's not that typical for me. And plus, I just think it's, in Ronald D. Moore, I was reading a quote for him where he was saying that he thought it was a very interesting thing to try to put our characters into situations that they aren't accustomed to, such as having Counselor Troi take command of the Enterprise. So I like that storyline. I like the one with Riker and Data trying to get the engineering, although that's probably the storyline they covered the least. That probably takes up the least amount of screen time out of all the storylines, but at least it has to do with the main plot. So those are and plus the whole moral dilemma they created with Ro fighting for, we need to separate the ship, and O'Brien saying that's damn cold-blooded. Like, that was interesting. So to me, that's definitely the hook of the episode. The stuff with Picard and the turbo lift, like, that was okay. But again, that's kind of cliche. You have to put someone who hates children with children, and they have to climb out of the elevator before it falls. But, again, there's some character moments in that storyline that I do like. I like how Picard has to get them says you're number one and give them all pips. He was actually very good at sort of building their morale, which is exactly what he needed, and getting them to sing a song as they're climbing. So that was okay. The storyline with Worf and Keiko, again, I don't know if I'd say it was my least favorite, but it was one of my least favorites. It's funny because I heard a lot of people say it was their favorite. But it was just too cliche to me. Like, the pregnant woman has to give birth in a disaster, and look at how funny it is that Worf has to deliver the baby. Whoa. Now, that being said, there were some jokes that worked. Some of the stuff that Worf said about "you are now ready to deliver" or whatever, it was like, and just the funny stuff that he would say. Like, some of that humor worked, but overall, I just thought that whole storyline was way too cliche. The thing with Geaodi and Dr. Crusher, that was fine, I guess. I didn't hate it, but it was just like very stereotypical. At least it was a bit suspenseful, like how they're going to get out of this. There's this fire, and these barrels are about to explode. But again, they didn't really spend all that much time on this storyline. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, which is the bridge storyline with Counselor Troi. So, I've heard a lot of people sort of, even Michael Piller thought that they were too harsh on Ro, and it was a mistake to have her take this such a antagonistic position on only her second appearance and distance audiences from her. And apparently that is a reaction I have been seeing from some people who didn't like this character, or at least initially, because of the position she takes in this episode. And I actually really very much disagree with that, because, and there are some other people reviews I watched who actually understand this, that the position she takes is actually the correct and safest position. It is the most, as O'Brien put it, cold-blooded, but sometimes you do have to be cold-blooded in emergency situations like this, which is why it's such an interesting moral dilemma. And that the safest thing that Troi could have done is to actually go with Ro's plan, because as we saw in the episode, they were like a hair away from the whole ship exploding. So in other words, Troy's plan, or Troi going with O'Brien's plan, could have cost everyone on the ship their lives. Like, they were that close for her causing everyone on the ship to die. Now, granted, if they went with Ro's plan, that would guarantee that, I don't think it's half the people on the ship, it's less than half, but it's still a significant amount of people. And plus the ship would be destroyed. They would just have the saucer section. But I've heard someone even argue that it was in fact the right thing to do, that Ro's plan was the correct plan. And I don't know if I would put it that way, but I would definitely say that she had a huge point, and that Troi was risking a lot by not going with that plan. And so when Ro is doing stuff like when the engineering thing fails and the ship is about to explode, but O'Brien saves it in the last time, and Ro's like, this could happen again. This is exactly what I warned about that would happen, and O'Brien managed to fix it this time, but next time we might not be able to fix it, so you need to separate the ship now. I think she's completely justified in doing so. In fact, I don't think she doesn't really overstep her bounds because she always respects Troi. She always runs everything through Troi. She never tries to undermine Troi's authority, even though it's very clear that Troi's out of her element. But she does what any good first officer, which you could argue she's effectively a first officer in this situation, because if you consider O'Brien an enlisted man, that was kind of retconned at some point, because he definitely was a lieutenant at first, and then they retconned it for him to be an enlisted man. I don't know what he was at this point in time in the series. I don't know if he was a lieutenant or an enlisted man. I don't think the show even knows. But definitely by the time he got to Deep Space Nine, he was enlisted, or non-commissioned, not enlisted, non-commissioned, whatever, chief. But anyway, that was a retcon, so I don't know where they are at this point in the stage. But you can assume that Ro is effectively executive officer, and she's doing what any good executive officer would do, giving their commander options and urging them in what they think is best for the ship, but then listening to their commanding officer when they make a command decision. So I don't think she did anything wrong. And in fact, I think that she behaved exactly as a good officer should. I think she actually did a really good goddamn job. It just turns out that just by some miracle, by the skin of their teeth, that the whole ship didn't explode and everyone died. Like, just by the skin of their teeth, they were able to save everyone. But that possibility was so slim. And I've heard some other people argue that Rose should have been put in command of the ship because she's on the command track. That because Troi is not on the command track, that she's considered in like the medical field, I suppose you would put it there in. That unless someone in command directly puts her in command, that by default it should go to the highest ranking command officer, which was Ensign Ro. I suppose that other ensign on the bridge would have been equal to Ensign Ro. But Ensign Ro obviously had the more experience. But this, again, that's if you assume... Well, even if you don't assume O'Brien's not a lieutenant at this stage, he's still not in the command track. He's in the engineering track. But, I don't know. I don't think Star Trek usually follows those rules, though. So, I don't know if I would agree with that. But that is an interesting experiment. It did seem that Troi was not qualified. And that's what some people complain about, especially when you compare this episode to the episode Timescape, because in this episode Troi is completely ignorant. She doesn't know what the hell's going on. I love how she's like, oh, is that like a cosmic string? And O'Brien's like, no, that's actually a totally different thing. And a cosmic string, she probably had that on her mind because that was the anomaly or the phenomenon that occurred in the episode The Loss, where she had to work hard to overcome it. So that's why she was thinking about it that way. But anyway, she's portrayed as totally incompetent and has no command skills whatsoever. And then all of a sudden you jump to next season, towards the end of the season, so like a season and a half by now, the episode Timescape, where she's acting like she's in command. In fact, Data is there, so Data should be the commanding officer, not her, but she's giving orders and leading the away team and acting like, oh, I know exactly what I do just because I spent like a couple weeks on the Romulan ship where I spent most of the time on the bridge and in like the eating quarters, and so I know exactly how an engine room works now, which was bullshit. But she doesn't even know what can't tell the difference between a quantum film and a cosmic string. Yes, she knows how to operate a Romulan engine room. Such bullshit. But I already addressed that when I covered Timescape. I had some comments where people tried to argue with me about that, but they're wrong because that was completely inconsistent with her portrayal here. And plus, Data should be in command of the fucking away team. I don't care what the hell anyone says. Data definitely outranks her. Although I know later she gets promoted to commander, but even still, like if Dr. Crusher was in the away team, Data would still be put in command because he's the second officer of the fucking ship. Doesn't matter if someone in the medical field outranks him. He's still in a command position, outranks them. But anyway, that much is true because he's the second officer. But anyway, that's talking about time escape. So I really liked the conflict between Troi and Ro, and I agree with Ronald D. Moore. That was very interesting, seeing Troi out of her element and seeing someone in command who's not used to command. To me, this is definitely the highlight of the episode. Now, the stuff with Riker and Data, as I said, they barely focus on this. Is basically all that happens is Data has to put his body through the thing, and they take off his head, and they get to engineering, and they see the problem, they fix it. So there's really, it's more of connected to the main storyline. But here's the question I had: why was there no one in engineering? Like, did they answer this? Maybe they had a throwaway line at the beginning of the episode. Like, were they correct? Did everyone in the star drive die? Because Riker and Data were in 10 forward, which if you nerd out and look at the schematics of the ship, that's probably the furthest away, or one of the furthest away places away from the ship that you can get from main engineering. It's like super far away. So why was there not anyone closer who also had the same idea to get to main engineering? And how come they were cut off from sickbay and cut off from all these places, yet Data and Riker could still get to main engineering, which is the furthest away you could get? Now, granted, they did have that thing blocking their path that Data had to walk into in order to get there, but still, that was just the one obstacle. So that's from a strictly nerdy perspective. That was actually didn't make any sense. But, again, it's probably not good to try to apply logic to this episode. Anyway, that's pretty much all I gotta say about this episode. It was just a typical disaster story and used a lot of disaster movie cliches. Therefore, I don't think it's incredibly original, but it did have some good character moments. Now, the part at the end, I suppose I should talk about, where they made that stupid joke that was worthy of TOS. They should have had that goofy music that they used to have in season 1, going dun 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 dun, whenever they made a stupid joke. when they had Picard say, "You got the bridge number 1," the little girl was like, "Aye, sir." And then he said at the same time as Riker, who smiled, and Picard was like, when he nodded or something gotcha, or winked at her or something. I was like, Jesus Christ. That is so dumb. And if you hadn't seen my coverage of 2S, that was the thing I complained about the most. That used to irritate me the hell out of all the episodes of TOS that would end on a lighthearted joke where McCoy would say something racist, and then Spock would respond with something racist against humans, and they go, ho, 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 ho. God, I hated that. I hated that so much. But anyway... this is just as bad as that. And they used to do this shit in season 1 too, so I was like, oh, fuck. But anyway, so I would now like to thank all those that support me on Patreon, as very much appreciated. First, I'll give a very special thanks to Brandon Neil Howells. Thank you so much for all the support you give. It's very much appreciated. But I would also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So, we do have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who writes, Ronald D. Moore wrote the teleplay for this episode, and Philip A. Scorzesa, or however you pronounce it, Scorza, and Ron Jarvis wrote the story. Yet again, another 2 one-hit wonders. The traitor showed her true colors in this episode. What a selfish cow. Picard gave her chance 2 episodes ago, and what does she do when she gets when the going gets tough? Fuck 'em. fuck them all, I want to live. Even when Deanna senses people still alive around the ship. Miles should have tossed her out the bloody window for being a heartless bitch. This is one of the worst characters in all of Star Trek. For an episode I absolutely love, I don't have much else to say about it. Have you reviewed the next phase or whatever that episode is called? Let's talk about the next episode, The Game. What a shit episode. I give this awful episode 3 out of 10 just for Ashley Judd's appearance. Fred Bronson and Susan Sackett wrote another episode and it was almost as bad as The Game, and that was Menage a Troi. Brennan Braga had a hand with this episode, and did you ever watch The Center Seat, 55 Years of Star Trek? It is a 11 episode documentary. It was very good. I never knew that Brennan Braga and Jerry Taylor were an item. I think you mean Jerry Ryan. If I believe that's what you're getting at, because Brennan Braga and Jerry Ryan were an item. I'm not sure that he and Jerry Taylor were ever writing, so I'm assuming that's a typo. My rating is 10 more times Keiko pushed, and Worf kept asking her to push. If he said it one more time, I guess Keiko would have pushed him into Stover Core out of 10. God, 10 out of 10. That is high praise. Now, it's difficult for me. It was very difficult for me to read that section of about that you said about Ensign Rowe, because boy howdy, I could not possibly disagree with you more on her. She is one of my favorite. I think she's one of the best characters in TNG, one of the best characters in all of Star Trek. But that's just my opinion. I already addressed how I disagree with her stance. I actually think she did the right thing. So there we go. But that's, we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. Let's see. The next phase, I have not reviewed the next phase. So, and that is what it's called. So you have that. You can make a comment for that episode. You do have that to look forward to, where I'm sure you're going to trash Ensign Rose some more. But yeah, I have yet to review that. I did watch The Center Seat, 55 Years of Star Trek. However, I skipped over the part of the original series, and I might go back and watch them later. But I don't know, at the moment I just read all this. I already know a lot about the original series. I'm just not that interested in hearing anything more about it. I'm kind of sick of the original series right now. So I started with TNG and watched the ones about Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise, and the other two they had about captains or starship. Oh no, I skipped the starship one because I don't really give a shit about starships. I'm not a starship guy. But yeah, that was a very interesting documentary. I did learn something very interesting in that, because I actually did know that Brennan Braga and Jerry Ryan were an item. I heard that a few years back, so that one didn't surprise me. What did surprise me, and this is something I'll get into when I get to Enterprise, which is a long ways off, so I'll just mention it here, is that season 4 of Enterprise, no less, which is a long ways off for me covering that. But what I learned was at the end of season 3, when they did a cliffhanger where Archer woke up and were the Nazis there, and there was these alien. Brennan Braga and Rick Berman's original plan for season 4 was to do a season-long story arc where Archer and the Enterprise crew were stuck in Earth's past, or this alternate Nazi history. And my God, I can't believe that. That is so dumb. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. They were gonna, again, this is Brennan Braga he loves the 40s and 50s. He seems to love doing shit with Nazis. And it's a Star Trek show. A Star Trek show should not send a year in the fucking Nazi Germany, or Nazi occupied United States in this case, but still, it's what the ever-loving fuck. Now, thankfully, at this stage, the studio head who'd taken over Paramount, or not Paramount, but whatever was in charge, CBS was now in charge of Star Trek. I think that happened like during season 3, and he didn't like Rick Berman. Imagine that. Not liking Rick Berman, you don't say. And so he pulled back Rick Berman and Brenna Braga because he saw that Enterprise was not doing very good. And like towards the end of season 3, started pulling them back. And then by the time they got to the end of season 3 and they're going to start season 4, he pretty much took them both off of the show and just made them money people and took away any sort of creative input for season 4 and instead gave it to Manny Coto. And so, Brennan Braga and Rick Berman explained to Manny Coto that, look, this is the plan we have for season 4, to do a year-long story arc, but the show's yours now. You're the showrunner now, so you do whatever you want. And he was like, okay, well, if that's the case, I'm not going to fucking do that because that's stupid. And thank God for Manny Coto. He should have been the showrunner all along, and even Brennan Braga admits this. And so at the very least, you can give Manny Coto credit, because at the very least he didn't like retcon it at the very start of the episode and have him wake up, this is all a dream, this Nazi bullshit. And that would have been dumb. So at the very least he did pay it off in a 2-parter, which is more than that storyline deserved. So he didn't try to retcon or erase that ending. But he definitely didn't waste an entire season on it. He just got it over and done with in a 2-parter, and then got back to doing an actual Star Trek prequel for the first time in Enterprise's history. But anyway, yeah, that's a huge aside about Enterprise. That doesn't have anything to do with this episode. But you mentioned the center seat, and that's what I learned from the center seat. But as I said, I'll get more into detail on this, 3 or 4 years from now, whenever I finally get to Enterprise. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, So I am one to admit DS9 did the disaster theme better. Civil Defense, perhaps my favorite above all, but this certainly was fun. Of course, even though it's an ensemble, I prefer to call it a Troi episode, with Ro being a challenging antagonist, and that was the most interesting part of the episode. Given that, I find that with proper Starfleet training and everything, I have a bit trouble buying Troi did not know certain technobabble specifics, and it also makes one wonder how she would have handled some of her leadership if O'Brien wasn't on the bridge with her. But the conflict between Ro and her, and how Troi admitted at the end when Ro apologized and Troi admitted she could have been as right, makes it a compelling episode. Jean-Luc and the kids singing Frere Jacques, and to comically put him in the situation, that got on my nerves. I also have a bit of an issue of a rarely matched Geaodi and Crusher in a way as well, especially as they were able to accomplish their feat, might have needed a little more substance at the same time as pointing out good risk. Riker and Data's head as a solution was a bit better, but none of those in the perils beats what happened on the bridge. Troi gets credit for, while knowing what she obviously should have, and some tech specifics, was able to do fine enough in spite of her uneasiness, and definitely mimics at least persons who are suddenly either in temporary or substitute positions that may deal with someone who thinks they know better and should be in charge with all the auspicious past and limited experiences in other ways, was quite compelling. I'll give it 7.5. What is it about Gilbert and Sutherland and Trek out of 10? told you about the 0.5s. No, I'm just kidding. You do 0.5s if you want to. You can do 0.367 for all I care, but I just won't do 0.5s. Civil defense, you know what the funny thing is? I always thought that the Deep Space Nine counterpart to this episode was actually Starship Down, in which case I think Disaster is much better than Starship Down, because that was also a very clear disaster situation, although that was a bit different because it was in a battle situation, but it was very clear that Bashir and Dax stuck in this deck that was flooded and they're running out of oxygen, very similar to the Jordan Crusher storyline. You had Sisko injured on the bridge and Kira trying to treat him. That could be a surrogate for Keiko giving birth, someone giving medical treatment who doesn't really know how to do it. And then you have Worf taking command of engineering, the ship from engineering, which is kind of similar to the Troi thing, even though Worf does know how to command, but he doesn't know how to command the engineering officers, and he's dealing with a strange situation that he's not used to. And then you had Quark and that other dude stuck in the mess hall or whatever, where the torpedo almost detonated and they had to disarm the torpedo, similar to the whole Riker and Data thing where they have to go to engineering to fix it. So I think that is the most comparable episode to this episode, and I like this one better than Starship Down. But Civil Defense, to be fair, does also have some disaster elements. With Quark and Odo stuck in the security office, and you got Jake O'Brien and Benjamin Sisko, stuck in ore processing and trying to get out. But everyone else was on the ops. So to me, that's less of a comparison. And plus, and I do agree that's a much, much, much better episode. A much better episode. But I never saw it as a straight disaster episode, because that was more about one problem building off another. Like when they try to solve something, something else gets worse and something else gets worse. Where here, with the disaster thing, it's not so much of the problems building off of each other. It's just they have all these different problems all stemming from the disaster that they have to deal with. So it is kind of similar, I will grant you, but I don't see it as the closest comparison. I think that definitely goes to Starship Down, but that's just me. Anyway, hold on. I think Norman has another comment. Oh yes, I forgot to comment on Worf and Keiko. I'll just kindly say this. This attitude alone may demonstrate in character how Worf treats/views parenting. Oh God, good old, jab at Worf being a bad father. There was a great callback to the scene in a future DS9 episode when Worf hears Keiko's pregnant a second time and reacts something like, "She's giving birth now?" in horror. LOL. Now what it was Keiko and Miles, who were telling everyone in Quark's like, "Hey, Keiko's pregnant again," and Worf is there, and someone's like, "Oh yeah, O'Brien." Like, even said, "Oh, Worf was there to, deliver Molly. He delivered our first baby." And then Bashir went up to Worf and was like, "Oh, yeah, well, if you like, you can help me deliver the next baby. You can be present for that and help give advice." And Worf is just like, "No, I'm going to be away from the station at that moment. Far away." That wasn't. I don't remember what episode that was, but I do remember that scene. I did like the callback as well. That I was very much appreciated that. Anyway, next comment is from Greg Marley, who says, "This is a standout episode, one you remember years and years later. It's great that they let Ro take a stand. Others would say makes her heartless." Makes her a heartless asshole. For one, it creates compelling tension and conflict, and two, it's thoroughly believable. In a real disaster, And in great disaster movies like the Poseidon Adventure, you see people thrust in horrendous situations where terrible choices do have to be made, and it's completely in character that someone as decisive as Ro might in good conscience arrive at a position that she did. And as they were honest enough to have Deanna herself admit you could have easily been right, Michelle Forbes had real presence and added an invigorating spark to what was by now a well-worn cast. It's such a shame that she didn't stick around. Couldn't disagree. I couldn't agree with that more. It is a shame she couldn't stick around. Riker and Data have a pretty cool side story, and Geaodi and Crusher are a good pairing, if only because they don't always interact that much. It's fun seeing Picard being uncomfortable with children, a callback to his original gruff characterization as far back as the pilot. And Worf delivering Keiko's baby has moments of levity. O'Brien is so likable in this fairly sizable role, mediating between Ro and Deanna. He thoroughly graduated by now from a familiar background characters to someone the series took note of. What a career arc Colin Meaney had, going from just being referred to by his position, Khan, and Farpoint, all the way here, and then on to DS9. Talk about a lesson on the virtues of perseverance. Sorry. Denise Crosby, if only you had hung on through all this shit. That's true. I'm sure, like, Denise Crosby got out of the show during season 1 when the show was really bad, but she didn't know that the show would have gotten better. And to be frank, there was probably no one could have predicted that the show would have gotten much better. But I'm sure it's something she regretted. But yeah, so we're more in agreement on Ro. I think she did a pretty good job. So, anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, it's great how we see characters interacting who normally have little screen time together. At the end of the episode, the reset button is pressed all of a sudden. Although they succeeded in stabilizing the containment field, a lot of other problems remained that were only solved off screen. Also, the climb out of the turbolift wasn't shown because I don't see how Picard suddenly is able to climb out of it after it was impossible the rest of the time due to his broken ankle. The engineer who made the choice that you couldn't repressure the cargo bay from the same console that opens it should be fired. In the middle of the episode, there were some boring scenes with little progression. I think I like the scenes on the bridge best. Great to see the beginning of the arc of Troi becoming a more normal bridge and command officer instead of being just a counselor and the only one not to wear a standard uniform. My rating is an 8 out of 10. Yes, so that is a great point about the repressing the cargo bay. It's done for plot convenience to have it on the other side of the room so that they have to stumble to get to it, but it doesn't make any design sense whatsoever. Why the hell would you have the button that depressurizes the cargo, or that releases all the air, that opens the cargo bay, be far away from the button that repressurizes it once the oxygen has been put out? That makes zero sense. But yeah. So, yeah, and that's also a good point about Picard and his broken ankle. Like, they made it look like he wouldn't be able to climb out of a lift, but then they have him climb out of a lift off screen. It's like the whole pitch meeting thing whenever they ask, well, how did that happen? Because it happened off screen. Whatever. Alright, so final comment is from Brandon Neil Howells, who says, my idea of a disaster is putting Picard with children, so in a way the title of this episode is fitting. Does Troi have to be so very clueless? I like Rolaren, but she's a bit aggressive here. Why does Beverly sense the wall is hot, but Geaodi, the bloke with the visor, which can visualize heat, cannot? Riker and Data are entertaining, and Worf helping Keiko give birth is pure gold. Worf deserves more comedic moments. O'Brien deserves more lines. I think the resolution is too quick, but maybe that's just me. 6 engineers singing Gilbert and Sutherland off-key out of 10. I am the very mineral of the modern general. I'm the vegetable and mineral animal. I can't remember how that goes. The only way I've ever heard of it was through this episode, to be fair. But anywho, yeah, Troi is quite clueless. Worf, they do give him comedic moments here and there, like the one DS9 that references this episode that I talked about earlier. But yeah, it was fine. Anyway, but that is a very good point about Geaodi not sense. How could he not sense the heat with this fucking visor? He was looking right at it. But anyway, gotta have explosions. So anyway, thank you, patrons, very much for your comments. So my rating for Disaster out of 10 is going to be a 7, very good. Now, I was closer to giving this episode a 6. I was very close to giving it a 6 because it is too cliche for my tastes, and especially the Worf Keiko thing, I think was, they had some funny moments with Worf, but it was still just like eye rolling for most of it. And same thing with Picard with the kids. There was some good character stuff in there, but it was mostly like eye rolling, cliche stuff. But I think I give it the benefit of the doubt because of the Troi storyline with Ro was so good. And I love those kind of moral dilemmas, and I think it was played very well here, and I like how it was resolved with Riker and Data having to get the engineering and them sort of cross-referencing that. Although I will say, someone in the comments mentioned that Troi could sense people alive in the ship, but she couldn't sense where they were, and she specifically said that. So they still didn't know if anyone in the star drive section was alive. And the fact that no one actually went to engineering except for 2 people who are all the fuck way in 10 forward makes me think that maybe no one was alive in the star drive section, but that's not what they imply in this episode, though. But yeah, so it was a compelling seeing Troi in a position of command that she wasn't used to. It was compelling having that moral dilemma. So I will give it, that's definitely the strength of the episode for me. And it did have other character moments even throughout some of the cliche storylines. So I will give it a 7 instead of a 6. Give it the benefit of the doubt, but it is a weak 7, as they say. Anyway, that is it for my review for Disaster. So, let me just bring up the schedule here to see what is coming up next. So, Thursday, I'll be giving my review for Season 5 of Star Trek Discovery as a whole. Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon for my Patreon supporters to do a revisited for the game. So much fun. And then on Monday, back here for a new review, but this time covering something in The Expanse. Haven't covered in a while. Well, The Expanse doesn't have any new shows. What could I be covering? Well, I'm covering a comic book, which is not something I usually do, but there was a comic book series called Dragon's Tooth that will end recently, or just end, and so I'll be reviewing that this coming Monday. And then on Wednesday, back over on Patreon for another revisited, this time revisiting my review for Unification Parts 1 and 2. So that's what's coming up on my channel, so be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Next Generation and as I cover many more Star Trek videos, as well as many videos on many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.